The wind howled across the New Mexico plains like an unseen horse stampeding through the dry grass. Dust swirled along the ridges of the hills, catching the last light of the sun as it sank beneath the horizon. I sat by the lone window of my cabin, my chin resting on my knees, watching the sky streak in shades of burnt orange and violet. The glass was cold beneath my fingertips, frosting over in tiny patterns that I traced absent-mindedly. I had lived in this cabin for as long as I could remember, 16 years, but it had always felt like a place suspended between time and memory, a fragile world that belonged only to me. The cabin itself was nothing more than a wooden box stitched together from weathered planks and memories I couldn't name. A small hearth filled one corner, its stones blackened from years of fire. My bed was nothing more than patchwork quilts layered over a mattress that sagged in the middle, and the table I used to write letters to the wind looked as though it had been scavenged from a barn. There were no photos, no keepsakes, no reminders of the life I might have had before my memories grew hazy at age 8. Even the calendar on the wall, a simple sheet with hand-drawn squares marking the days, felt like a relic from someone else's life. October 15th, 1887. Another day. Another wind that carried the scent of sagebrush and the quiet ache of solitude. I didn't think of it as special. I had never known what it meant to have a birthday, or someone to notice that I existed beyond the small circle of dust and hills surrounding this cabin. A sudden rhythm of hoofbeats shattered my thoughts, a sound both startling and familiar. Through the settling haze of dust, I saw the figure of a man approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, mounted on a horse that moved with careful precision across the uneven earth. Everyone in town called him Holt, though I had never known anyone who truly knew his first name. He was the owner of the largest ranch in the territory, the kind of man whose shadow stretched longer than the sun itself. People said he was cold, unyielding, a man whose heart had been carved by the harsh New Mexico sun. I watched him ride closer, my pulse quickening for reasons I couldn't explain. His visits were rare, and usually businesslike. Supplies, provisions, small favors that the townspeople organized for me. He never lingered. He never smiled. Yet there was something in his gray eyes that made me feel seen, even when I had spent years believing that I was invisible. The horse came to a halt at the edge of the cabin. I smoothed the folds of my dress, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, and opened the door. He dismounted silently, boots crunching softly against the packed dirt. There was a weariness in his posture that spoke of long days and longer regrets, though I could not yet name them. In his arms he carried a crate of supplies, flour, preserves, bread, and yet I felt something unspoken in the way he hesitated at the doorway. Not fear, exactly, but an awareness, a pause as though he had stumbled across a fragile memory he hadn't dared to confront. I watched him move, arranging the items on the table with a quiet grace. The cabin was silent except for the soft scrape of wood on wood. He glanced around the room as if searching for a clue, some sign that this tiny space, this collection of shadows and light, was more than just a shelter. And maybe it was, because for the first time I sensed that my life, all my quiet days of solitude, mattered to someone else, someone I had never truly understood until this very moment. And that's when it occurred to me, though I couldn't say the words aloud, that I had never had a birthday. Not once. 16 years of sunlight and moonlight, laughter and tears, without a single person to mark the day I had entered the world. A strange, hollow realization that tugged at my chest, making the autumn wind seem even colder than it was outside. Holt moved around the cabin with a quiet efficiency, setting down the jars of preserves and the small sacks of flour. I watched him, my hands folded in my lap, feeling a curious mixture of gratitude and unease. There was something about his presence that filled the empty corners of the cabin, yet at the same time, it reminded me of all the ways my life had been incomplete. The air smelled faintly of the wood smoke from the hearth, mingling with the faint sweetness of honey from the jar he had placed carefully on the table. I realized, almost with a shock, that he had come farther than necessary tonight. There was no urgent need for him to be here after the sun had already dipped behind the hills. And yet, he was here. The thought sent a ripple of warmth through my chest, an unfamiliar sensation I couldn't quite name. I had spent so long thinking that people came only when needed, only when duty required it. Seeing him here, standing quietly in the doorway, made me wonder if someone could care without reason, simply because it mattered to them. His eyes lingered on the calendar hanging by the wall, the page marked in neat, hand-drawn squares. I followed his gaze and noticed the furrow of his brow. "October 15th, he muttered softly, more to himself than to me. There was an almost imperceptible weight in his voice, a hesitation that made my pulse quicken. I didn't know what it meant, but it felt important, as though some hidden truth hovered just beyond the edges of my understanding. For a moment, silence stretched between us. I thought about saying something, asking a question that had been growing quietly in my mind for weeks, but the words stuck in my throat. He moved closer to the table, picking up a small candlestick that had been gathering dust, examining it with careful attention. My eyes followed his hands, the way they trembled ever so slightly as he turned the metal in his fingers. There was a story in those hands, I could feel it, a story of labor, of guilt, of loss. The thought came to me, sudden and strange. I had never celebrated anything. Not birthdays, not holidays, not even the little victories that other children seemed to share with their families. 16 years of sunrise and sunset had passed, and no one had marked the day I was born. The notion pressed against me, a tender ache I had buried beneath the routines of isolation. And now, with Holt here, quiet and deliberate, it felt as though something might finally shift, as though the empty spaces of my life could be filled, even just a little. I didn't speak. I simply watched, and in that watching, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, tonight could be the beginning of something I had never imagined, a day that was mine, a day that mattered. And somehow I knew, without understanding why, that Holt might be the one to make it happen. Holt's hands lingered on the candlestick longer than necessary, and I could feel the gravity of his attention pressing on the small cabin. There was a quiet deliberateness to the way he moved, as if each action carried the weight of years of careful thought, regret, and unspoken memories. I traced the patterns in the frost on the window again, but this time my mind wasn't empty. Something had shifted, a subtle recognition that tonight was different, that the wind outside carried not just cold and dust, but possibility. I remembered the few times he had visited before, leaving bundles of food and supplies on my table without saying much. I had accepted them silently, never daring to ask why, and never imagining that the giver might have been watching over me all this time. The thought brought a strange warmth to my chest, one that felt almost dangerous in its unfamiliarity. It made the hollow ache I carried feel lighter, like a door had been nudged open somewhere deep inside me. Holt set the candlestick down carefully on the table, his eyes scanning the sparse interior. "You've never had a birthday," I said suddenly, my voice almost a whisper, as if speaking it aloud would break the fragile moment. He paused, the corners of his mouth tightening, and I could sense the shift in the air. There was no shame in his gaze, only something heavier, an acknowledgement, a recognition of a void I hadn't known could be filled. I didn't need to ask him, not really. Somehow, he understood. His movements became purposeful yet gentle. He reached into the crate and set out the small jar of honey, the biscuits, the few scraps of supplies he had brought from town. And as he arranged them on the table, my chest tightened with anticipation. It was absurd, almost comical, to imagine a birthday being celebrated with so little, yet something in the quiet sincerity of his actions made it feel monumental. I couldn't stop myself from imagining what it might feel like, to have someone mark the day I was born, to acknowledge that I existed in a way that mattered. 16 years of solitary mornings and evenings had passed without such recognition. And now, with Holt here, moving carefully around the small room, it seemed as if the universe itself had paused to allow this one small miracle. The candle flickered slightly as he struck a match, and I watched the flame take life, the warmth spilling across the table and my face. The simple glow transformed the room in ways I had never imagined possible. For the first time, I felt seen, not just as Annie May, the girl living alone in a cabin, but as someone worthy of celebration, worthy of attention, worthy of being wished for. And in that moment, I understood that birthdays were never really about gifts or grand gestures. They were about acknowledgement, about being noticed and loved, even when the world had forgotten you. The candlelight trembled against the walls, casting long shadows that danced across the cabin like silent witnesses. I sat at the table, my hands folded over my lap, feeling a strange, fluttering mix of anticipation and disbelief. For 16 years, I had known routine, solitude, and the quiet hum of a life untouched by celebration. Yet tonight felt different. There was an unspoken promise in the way Holt moved, a careful reverence in every gesture as if he were piecing together something fragile, something sacred. He arranged the small biscuits on a chipped plate, drizzling honey with meticulous care. I watched, almost afraid to breathe, because this simple act, simple yet profound, felt like a lifeline reaching across the void of my childhood. I had never realized how heavy the absence of recognition could be, how much it could shape the corners of a person's world. And now, with Holt standing there, tending to the tiniest details, it became clear that someone had noticed me, that someone had carried my life in their heart without ever speaking a word. My thoughts wandered unbidden to the memories I could barely recall, shards of firelight, the faint scent of bread baking, laughter that felt like warmth from another world. I had buried those fragments under layers of time, under the cold winds and the dust of the plains, yet now they surfaced, trembling like ghosts in the flickering lamplight. Could it be possible, I wondered, that those scattered pieces of the past were more than coincidence? That there might be someone still tied to them, someone who had never forgotten? Holt's hands paused as he struck another match, the small flame dancing to life. I noticed the tremor in his fingers, subtle but undeniable. It was as though each movement carried years of regret and unspoken grief. And I realized then that this celebration, my first, was not merely about me. It was also about him, about the burdens he carried silently, about the quiet guilt that had weighed on his shoulders for reasons I could not yet understand. I leaned forward slightly, my green eyes reflecting the warm glow of the candle, and felt an unexpected courage rise within me. 16 years of loneliness had taught me to measure my worth quietly, to survive without acknowledgement. But now, sitting across from this man who had arrived with provisions and gentleness, I felt the tentative stirrings of hope. Perhaps life could be more than survival. Perhaps it could be remembered, celebrated, and held close in ways I had never dared to imagine. The first flicker of a smile tugged at my lips, fragile but genuine. The idea of a birthday, my birthday, no longer seemed impossible. And deep down, beneath the cautious optimism, a question lingered, unspoken but insistent. Why had he chosen tonight? Why had he brought light, honey, and small biscuits into the shadows of my solitary life? There was a purpose behind it. I sensed it, something larger than this room, larger than the quiet of my cabin. And for the first time, I dared to hope that I might discover it. As I sat at the table, the candlelight casting a warm glow on the rough wooden boards, I began to notice the quiet details of Holt's presence. The way his eyes lingered on the corners of the cabin, the way he adjusted the supplies with careful precision, as though he were protecting something far more than flour and biscuits. A strange realization began to creep over me. For years, someone had been watching over me, ensuring that I had what I needed to survive in this isolated corner of New Mexico. The thought was both comforting and unsettling, stirring feelings I had never allowed myself to feel before. I remembered the sporadic deliveries of food and small necessities over the years, always arriving without warning, always left with a careful note or quietly set on my table. I had accepted them without question, too lonely to consider the person behind the gesture, too used to solitude to imagine a motive beyond duty or coincidence. And now, sitting across from Holt, I felt the weight of all those unspoken years pressing gently on my shoulders. Somehow, it had always been him. Somehow, he had never left me completely alone. The flickering flame of the candle reflected in his steel-grey eyes, and I noticed a shadow there, a depth of sorrow and remembrance that I couldn't yet fully comprehend. He moved with a strange tenderness, handling each biscuit and jar with care, as though he were mending not just the food he had brought, but the invisible fractures of my life. And I understood, in a quiet, sudden way, that the gestures that had always seemed small or ordinary carried a profound weight, one that spoke of guilt, protection, and a longing to make right something that had long been wrong. My own memories stirred uneasily beneath the surface, fragmented and hazy, like scattered pieces of glass reflecting a past I could not fully see. I remembered fire, the heat, the screaming, the terror of being alone, and yet those memories were tangled with glimpses of warmth and safety I could not place. Perhaps this man, this stranger who had been quietly present all these years, held the key to understanding what had been lost and forgotten. I watched Holt pause, his hand hovering over the candle as though uncertain of the next step, and I felt a strange mix of hope and apprehension. Perhaps tonight would reveal more than a birthday. It might reveal the truth, a connection that had been hidden just beyond my reach. My heart beat faster at the thought, and yet I could not speak, afraid that words might shatter the delicate moment. Instead, I simply sat, letting the candlelight illuminate the quiet cabin and the man who had quietly shaped the course of my life without my ever knowing it. Holt's gaze lingered on the small calendar pinned to the wall, the one I had barely given a thought until now. October 15th, he muttered softly, as though the date itself carried a weight neither of us fully understood yet. I tilted my head, puzzled. For me, it was just another day, a day like any other, with the same wind sweeping the plains and the same quiet filling the cabin. But there was a strange gravity in his voice, a pause that felt heavier than mere curiosity. He reached into the crate again, pulling out the small candlestick and examining it with a concentration that made me wonder if this simple object held more meaning to him than I could imagine. My pulse quickened with a strange anticipation. There was something unspoken in the way he handled it, a message hidden in his careful movements. I felt the old ache of loneliness stir inside me, the one I had carried for 16 years, and somehow, for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine that it could be replaced with something else. Attention, acknowledgement, even celebration. Then, almost gently, Holt spoke the words that would change everything. He suggested, quietly but firmly, that tonight could be special. That even if I had never celebrated a birthday, maybe we could mark it now, right here, with a candle and the honeyed biscuits and whatever little we had at hand. The absurdity of it made me laugh softly, a sound that surprised me, because I had never thought of birthdays as possible for someone like me. And yet, there was a tenderness in his voice, a certainty that this simple act could fill a void I hadn't known could be filled. I watched him as he arranged the candle in the center of the table, my eyes tracing every careful movement, every hesitated touch, as though the candlelight itself were weaving a bridge between our solitary lives. I realized then that this moment was about more than a birthday. It was about recognition, about being seen for the first time. And as the flame flickered and danced across his face, I sensed something I had never dared hope for. A connection, a silent promise that my life mattered to someone beyond the vast emptiness of the plains. For a moment, the past, the fragments of memories I could barely grasp, hovered at the edges of my mind. Fire, heat, voices, confusion. And somehow, in the quiet, unassuming way he had orchestrated this small celebration, I sensed that the answers, the truth about who I was and where I had come from, were quietly waiting to be discovered. Tonight, I realized, could be the night everything changed. The tiny flame of the candle cast long shadows across the cabin, dancing over the worn boards and the small piles of supplies Holt had brought. I watched him carefully, noticing for the first time the faint tremor in his hands, the way his eyes carried a quiet sorrow I couldn't yet name. There was more in this man than the stern, distant reputation that everyone in town whispered about. Tonight, I realized, he carried years of unspoken grief, and somehow it had been intertwined with my life all along. As he moved with deliberate care, arranging the honeyed biscuits around the candlestick, the thought struck me like a sudden wind through the hills. He had been watching over me. Not from obligation, not from chance, but with purpose. For 16 years, someone had ensured I had enough to eat, enough to survive, and now, here he was, creating a celebration that I had never imagined could exist. The realization stirred something deep within me, a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a hesitant, tender hope I could not yet name. And in the flickering light, a memory surfaced, faint and fragmented. The smell of smoke, the warmth of hands that once held me, the sensation of being watched, protected in some way I could not understand. My pulse quickened. Could it be that the pieces of my past were connected to this man, the man who had quietly carried the weight of my life without me knowing? The thought was both terrifying and comforting, and for the first time in years, I felt the fragile stirrings of something I had never allowed myself to feel: belonging. As the candlelight flickered across the cabin walls, memories long buried began to creep through the edges of my mind. Flashes of fire, screams, and a sense of being small and utterly alone. The fragments were jagged, incomplete, yet their weight pressed against my chest. I looked at Holt, standing quietly across from me, and something unspoken passed between us. The way he lingered, the way he had brought supplies all these years, suddenly made a strange, terrifying sense. I realized that the emptiness I had carried for so long was not just my own. It had been shared silently, across the distance of unspoken guilt and quiet protection. Every gesture, every delivery, every careful action he had taken was not just kindness. It was a shield, a way to undo a wrong neither of us had yet fully confronted. My pulse quickened as I saw the faint tremor in his hands, and I understood that there were truths neither of us had dared speak, but both had been waiting for the right moment to reveal. And tonight, in this small, lonely cabin illuminated by a single candle, the moment had arrived. The flame danced in the draught from the window, and I felt it as more than light. It was a bridge between past and present, between loss and recognition. Somewhere deep in my chest, hope stirred for the first time in 16 years, fragile and shimmering, as I sensed that what I had been searching for all my life, answers, family, belonging, might finally be within reach. The flickering candlelight revealed the lines in Holt's face, etched with years of labor, loss, and silent sorrow. I noticed a subtle tightness around his eyes, a shadow that seemed to carry decades of regret. And then, almost without thinking, I asked the question that had been forming in my mind for weeks. Why had he come so far, so often, bringing supplies no one asked for? His hands froze over the candlestick, and for the first time, he didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken truths. I felt it in my bones. He knew more about me than I realized. Somehow, in the quiet of these 16 years, he had been intertwined with my survival. My pulse quickened, memories of fire, smoke, and distant voices swirling in fragmented recollections. Could he know something about that night, about the family I barely remembered? The idea sent shivers down my spine, both terrifying and comforting. Holt finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate, carrying a weight that made the cabin feel smaller, more intimate. "You've been alone for a long time, Annie May," he said, and I realized he had always known, had always watched over me. The truth was hanging in the air, fragile yet undeniable. Somewhere, in the spaces between words, I sensed that my past and his grief were connected in ways I had never imagined, and that tonight, that connection might finally be revealed. Holt's hands trembled as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph, its edges curled with age. The image was faint, almost obscured by time, but as he held it toward me, my breath caught. There I was, or rather, a baby I faintly recognized in my fragmented memories, swaddled and small, with grey eyes that mirrored my own. And beside me, a boy who looked so much like him, so impossibly familiar, that a shiver ran down my spine. The pieces clicked into place in a dizzying rush of realization. The fire, the smoke, the empty cabin, they weren't just fragments of a lonely past. I had survived that night, and somehow, Holt had been connected all along. He had been the boy in the photograph, the one who should have protected me, the one who had carried my memory and quietly ensured my survival all these years. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered, barely audibly, "You're my brother?" His voice cracked with years of suppressed grief, sorrow spilling over like a dam breaking. "You survived. Annabelle. You were never gone." The name struck me like a thunderclap. Annabelle Garrett. My life, my isolation, my stolen childhood, it all made sense now. Holt had been living with the guilt of that night, unaware that I had lived, unaware that he had quietly nurtured my existence from the shadows. In that moment, the cabin seemed to shrink around us, and yet it expanded in warmth and love. The candle flickered, illuminating our faces as we grasped each other's hands, bridging the gap of 8 lost years. I was no longer just Annie May, the lonely girl in the cabin. I was Annabelle Garrett, his sister, alive, found, and finally reunited with the family I had longed for in silence. The cabin, once a place of solitude and quiet despair, now radiated warmth and light. Holt and I sat across from each other at the table, hands still clasped, the flickering candle between us like a small beacon of hope. For the first time, I felt the weight of 16 years of loneliness lift, replaced by the undeniable presence of family and belonging. The photograph lay between us, a bridge across years of separation, a testament to survival and love. Holt's eyes, softened by tears and relief, met mine with a tenderness I had never seen before. He had carried guilt for so long, but now, holding me here, he seemed lighter, freed by the knowledge that I was alive and whole. My heart swelled as I realized that his protection, his quiet acts of kindness over the years, had been his way of atoning for a night that neither of us fully understood until now. We prepared the modest birthday cake together, a simple arrangement of honey biscuits with a candlestick in the center. I blew out the flickering flame, my wish unspoken yet filled with gratitude, hope, and love. For him, for myself, and for the life that had been preserved against all odds. In that moment, I wasn't just celebrating a birthday. I was celebrating survival, reunion, and the rediscovery of family. As we stepped outside into the crisp night air, the New Mexico sky glittered with stars, each one a reminder that even in the darkest stretches of life, light could find its way through. For the first time, I felt whole, anchored by the bond with my brother, and certain that no matter what the future held, we would face it together. The past, once a burden, had become a story of love, resilience, and the undeniable proof that some miracles, however delayed, were worth waiting for. Thank you for joining this journey through the Old West. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to feel that their life matters. Leave a comment telling us what moved you most about Annabelle and Holt's reunion, and where you're watching from. Remember, everyone deserves to be celebrated, and every life holds a story worth telling.